The candles are low and steady when I tell myself not to tremble. The flames make the silverware glint like tiny accusations. Outside, the house hums with neighborly lights and distant carols. Inside, the hum is mine, the low electrical buzz of forced normalcy. The tablecloth is ironed to a crease so precise it looks like a white line of discipline. The lamb in the oven smells of rosemary and smoke. The crystal glasses catch the tree lights and scatter diamonds across the mahogany. Everything in this room is arranged to be lovely and entirely lethal. He sits where he always sits, the head of the table, where he learns to command, where he practices the small, persuasive gestures that made me marry him. Marcus is buttoned up in a sweater the color of wet coal, his hair combed with that practiced casualness he thinks reads as effortless. He has a way of smiling that says, I am the calm center of this household. He does not know that my calm tonight is an instrument. My ex is coming for Christmas, he says, as if announcing the weather. The sentence falls between us like a tiny cold stone. He watches my face, hunting for some crack to exploit, the same way he'd learned how to ask for more time at work, more space, more forgiveness. He expects either fury that'll make him uncomfortable or tearful pleading he'll be able to soothe. He expects me to go small, to be predictable. Instead, I fold my napkin and sip my wine. I smile. It's the kind of smile you save for detonations, soft, measured, and not meant to comfort anyone. Good, I say, like I'm commenting on a plot twist in a play I already know how it ends. Bring her. A beat longer than it should, the room breathes with the silence that follows an announcement no one else knows how to react to. The chandelier's crystals tinkle in the pause. The way Marcus looks at me then, surprised, maybe impressed, makes me imagine him seeing a reflection of himself in a mirror that doesn't flatter. This is where the story should end for him. For 1,000 nights before this one, we'd share small deceptions, the white lies, the late texts, the vacations I paid for with credit card points he said he'd reimburse. But tonight is not about the 1,000 tiny betrayals. It's about the one that took everything else and made it look like collateral. October 15th, our 7th anniversary. We pretended to forget the number, the way you pretend not to notice the spider on the wall when company comes. I had bought a dress I liked, simple, the sort of black that made my skin look incandescent. He bought a bottle of wine expensive enough to sting a little. We went to our favorite restaurant near the river. There were chandeliers and laughter we were both faking a little too well. That night, under clapboard light and the hum of other people's joy, I found the first message. It was labeled only as VH on his messages, 2 letters, an abbreviation. My fingers hovered because for a fraction of a second I considered the only honest thing I could do, walk out. But my body is small and its habits are big. Instead, I waited until he went to the bathroom, and then, absurdly, I opened his phone. People will have their opinions about that choice. I had mine. I also have the rest of what followed. The messages were patient and intimate in a way that revolted me. Not pornographic, but invasive. Maps of days, lists of restaurants, references to last night and when you couldn't make it. There were photographs, smudged, shadowed, of him in a hotel bed, his arm across someone. There was a reference to June 15th. June 15th is the day I lost the baby. Saying that aloud almost broke me. The miscarriage itself is a private, raw wound I still hold with gloves on. To learn that during the days I was bleeding and sleeping and trying not to become a husk, he was making plans with her, that was a kind of cruelty that had a blueprint. I folded the phone and sat very still until the lights blurred. For an hour, I thought of leaving his life like I thought of dyeing my hair, an impulsive notion that faded when the consequences marched in. I did not confront him that night. I did not scream. I put the dress back in its bag and we went to bed with the curtains drawn. Instead, I started making lists. I wrote dates in the back of a cookbook I keep for guests. October 15th, June 15th. The messages had timestamps. There was a hotel receipt I glimpsed in a photo, an imprint of a name and a date on a crumpled napkin. Not enough on its own. Not yet. That night, I decided to rent patience. People like to imagine that revenge is a single cinematic moment. In real life, for most of us, revenge is paperwork, presence, and endurance. Reclaiming your life from the person who took it is mostly logistical. Documents, calls, witnesses, a cool head. You need evidence. You need someone who knows how to follow paper trails, because people who pretend to be upright citizens with children and mortgage payments rarely leave love letters taped to tree trunks. I hired Sam. He came recommended through a woman I met in a building where my sister Lauren worked. Sam was an ex-cop with a jaw like carved wood and an unexpectedly tender laugh when he described the absurdities of married men who think they are clever. He listened to my story without interruptions, taking notes in a reporter's notebook even though he's not pretending to be anyone's savior. His fee was honest. That was attractive in its way. I find things, he said. Not pretty, not clean, but true things. I gave him the VH messages on a flash drive, the photos I'd copied to my own email before I closed the phone back up, and the dates I was sure of. We didn't talk about methods. I didn't want to know method details. In every plan, there's always the risk of doing something you cannot unsee or unrecover from, of new moral holes opening under your feet.
Sam promised discretion and the kind of competence that smells like old coffee and patience. He found the hotel receipt. He found credit card charges that lined up with dates in the messages, dining in hotels 2 and 3 neighborhoods away from where I'd been sleeping at night. One charge was for late-night room service on June 16th, while I had been at home, white as a sheet, calling numbers that led to dead ends. Those were not proof on their own, but they were thread. The threads, when sewn together, made a map. It was about 2 weeks after October 15th when I realized something else. Victoria Hawthorne was not only his ex, but a licensed family therapist. Her professional bio, worn photos carefully cropped, painted her as a healer. That was the last thing I expected to find, and it cut deep in a way that was not only personal, but ethical. People trust therapists with the most intimate parts of themselves. To find out your partner's other confidant is someone sworn to confidentiality added a theater of betrayal to the personal one. You should document everything, Vivian Porter, the attorney I met in a tiny office smelling of lemon oil and old law books, told me. Vivian is polished in a way that says she reads statutes in the bath. Her face softened when I told her about the miscarriage. Lawyers aren't there to show empathy, but they are useful when they do. She pushed a folder across her desk, populated with brochures and a timeline template. We need dates, receipts, the PI report. Once you have that, you can decide whether to make an ethics complaint. But you must be prepared. That will be messy and public. Will it cost me? I asked. Because of course I wanted justice, but I had to ask how much of my life it would demand. Everything, she said, and meant it in the boring, inevitable way of lawyers. It will cost you time, money, privacy, but it will also give you a record. That matters. I never asked Sam to do anything illegal. I never needed to. There is a difference between digging and cracking a safe. Sam dug his way to a dated receipt with the same hotel's logo as the photograph. He found a ring photograph Victoria had posted on Instagram, crisp, posted November 15th, where her hand rested on a man's chest and a ring glinted like a small promise. Alex Ramos's name was in the comments. He was tagged in a photograph where the couple looked young and bewildered. There were captions, "Can't wait," that told an engagement story. Alex, as it turned out, was a man in love who had been given the wrong parts of life to believe in. He wasn't a villain. He looked at betrayal the way a kid looks at scraped knees, confused, stunned, and in need of a hand. Finding him was accidental and deliberate at the same time. I asked Lauren to look up Victoria's social posts. Lauren is my anchor, 2 years younger, fierce, with a laugh that snaps like a rubber band when she's angry. She texted me the tagged photos and a screenshot of a post from November 15th.
"You're going to want to meet him," she wrote. She didn't mean as an ally at first. She meant as someone to hurt alongside me. I chose to do something different. There are many ways to respond to betrayal. You can shriek, you can vanish, you can throw dishes. I could have called him a liar at the table in October and watched his face go through 1,000 shades of guilt and practiced regret. I could have screamed his deeds into the living room like a confession. Instead, I decided on a slow, surgical approach. I wanted the truth to live in public, where it could not be softened by his charm. I wanted documentation. I wanted consequences that had teeth. Sam presented the first PI report in mid-November. It was a neat packet with dates in bold. June 16th, room service charge, $67.50. July 2nd, 2 consecutive hotel stays 30 miles away. October 13th, matching notes with messages. He also included a photograph taken from a distance of Victoria leaving the hotel with a small bag, hair loose, face exhausted, as if she had been held up in a borrowed life. The report contained nothing salacious, nothing lurid. It was purely records, timestamps, transaction numbers, public posts, and witness statements from a woman who'd remember seeing Victoria in a cafe with Marcus, while I had been home that night thinking perhaps I had imagined everything. There is a peculiar kind of grief that is both hot and practical. You sit in your kitchen and your heart feels like a fist. You also have to call your mortgage company sometimes. My grief required me to do the latter more than the former. There were custody questions if we ended up divorced. There were financial considerations, what happens to our joint accounts. There were small humiliations like asking for the receipts from dinners we'd had and parsing them as if they were evidence in a court. That part taught me something unforgiving. The enemy of grief is randomness. You feel less lost when you can place every event in a timeline, like beads on a string. Before November 15th, the house became a stage set. I learned the ancient, dangerous craft of acting married. I warmed dinners Marcus liked and laughed at his jokes with a practice that made my cheeks hurt. I texted him questions about work and made plans for the holiday season so we could not be accused of an abrupt collapse of decorum. I wore his favorite black dress more for classical reasons than for comfort. People kept asking whether I was okay. I nodded. Lauren texted me, small affirmations like a supply line. "You're not alone," she whispered in messages. James, her husband, brought casseroles and little pragmatic advice about pension division. They didn't try to make the pain pretty. They made it manageable. On November 15th, under the garish light of a suburban Sunday, Alex and Victoria hosted a small engagement dinner. They posted photographs, cake, clinking glasses, Victoria's hand with that ring. It looked like a thing he could be proud of.
I stalked the posts, not because I was obsessed, but because the internet is a library of human decisions, public and private. There was a photograph where Marcus appeared in the background of one snap, smiling like a man who had no idea the thread of his life had been pulled. That is the thing with betrayals. People hide them like contraband until they are sure they can take the breath away from anyone who might object. Marcus hid in small, presentable ways. Victoria hid in a profession devoted to trust and care. Alex hid behind the shiny newness of engagement, the easiest kind of faith to buy. By mid-November, we had a plan thick enough to sit on. Vivian told me the divorce paperwork could be prepared in a week. The ethics complaint could be drafted once we had the receipts and the PI report. Legally, there is no guaranteed sequence that means a therapist loses a license for sleeping with a client's ex. Ethics investigations are slow and choked with red tape. But witnesses matter. Evidence matters. A therapist's reputation lives on trust. Once that trust is punctured in public, reputations rarely reincarnate to their former shine without months of polished apologies, therapy disclaimers, and a careful audit of billing codes. That was not my immediate concern, but it mattered in the arc of public accountability I intended. We crafted a timeline that would be easy to present. June 15th, the miscarriage. July to October, dates of travel. October 15th, the discovery. November 15th, the engagement post. December 24th, Christmas Eve, the dinner. Dates are cruel in their clarity. They leave no room for the fog of excuses. They also make a story deliverable to a judge or a press outlet should we need one. I do not pretend to be noble. There were nights when I drank alone in the kitchen and considered unseemly things, thoughts that tasted like quick victories in the mouth and left bitterness after. I gave them as much space as a person gives a splinter, an irritation to pry out later. The truth is messy, so is the human heart. What I wanted most was not to humiliate Victoria or to ruin Marcus for sport. I wanted the truth to be a thing that could be seen clearly and acted upon. I wanted to quit waking in a cold sweat and find a life I recognized. In the weeks leading to Christmas, I rehearsed my composure like a pianist rehearses scales. I set the table 3 times, once to test the placement of cutlery, once to time the arrival of the lamb at the table so the scent would begin at the same time as the guests, and a 3rd time to practice the faces I'd give when Marcus told a joke. The table itself became an actor, its linen and polished silverware delivering silence and threat. I bought an extra set of napkins, navy, because I wanted the colors to be controlled. I wanted everything to whisper intentionality. There is an animal cunning that surfaces when you stop trusting the narrative you've been sold about your life. You begin to see your days as a series of choices laid end to end, and you start choosing with a new generosity toward yourself. For me, that generosity looked like an envelope of divorce papers folded into a pocket of my coat, and a sealed folder I left with Sam, the PI, labeled, "For December 24." I did not carry the papers like a bomb. I carried them like an insurance policy, and a declaration. The weeks dragged and then sprinted with the cheap velocity of holiday preparations. Guests answered invitations with the casual manners of people who assumed nothing would explode in anyone else's living room. Marcus was careful in ways that made me suspicious. He called more, lingered by the sink, asked about small things. Once he asked if I wanted to go ice skating, that old, sweet ritual, and I said no because my legs felt like rocks and I had plans. I wasn't unwilling to take him away from his own gray life. I was unwilling to give him free range on mine. Lauren and James came early on weekends to help. Lauren stacked dishes in the sink with the kind of mechanical precision I've always admired. "You're sure about this?" she asked one night, standing in the doorway like a small general guarding my conscience. "I'm sure enough," I said. Sometimes sure is not a single emotion. It's the accumulation of everything that leads you to an action. We rehearsed the altruistic parts of my performance. I would be warm, glossy, and distractingly lovely. I would let Marcus lead the conversation, and I would laugh in the places we'd practiced, the way actors laugh to hide the space where a line might otherwise give them away. At the same time, we created safe routes for escape. The family friend who would pick me up if the dinner spun into violence, the neighbor prepared to call a cab. No one was under the illusion this was a play with no risk. There were unexpected allies, too. Anna, a woman from the gym, brought over a lemon meringue pie and confided she had noticed Victoria at spin class, always alone, always sharp. Jennifer, a friend of Lauren's who works at the hospital, offered to testify as to protocol standards and therapist behavior. She kept her words careful, as did I. Each small circle of support was a stitch, strength in collective hands. In late November, I sent a message to Alex under a different name. I won't say how we found the number. Mundane channels are enough for most real-life collisions. He answered like a man relieved to talk to someone who wasn't full of questions. We met at a cafe on November 29th. He looked younger in person than in the photographs, like a photograph tries to age you into resolve. He came in with a nervous energy, carrying the kind of tenderness you suspect will get bruised. We didn't meet to scheme. We met because I wanted him to know the truth as I knew it. I told him what I had found, carefully, without show. There was no point in weaponizing his pain. There was also no reason to protect Victoria now that the truth existed. He cried in the cafe, small, ugly sounds that made other people look away. He clutched his coffee like a raft. "She told me everything was okay," he said. "She said you were the ex you both had talked about, and that it was complicated." I believed her. I held my hands together, not out of piety, but because my fingers were busy holding myself together. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," I told him. "I'm asking you to see the facts." Alex did see the facts. He looked at the screenshots I showed him. Dates and silencers, the hotel photograph, the posts. He counted the days with me, like two people on the shore mapping tide lines. He felt betrayed the way my chest remembers the miscarriage, sudden and invasive. "Do you want to be part of this?" I asked. It was not a romantic offer. It was not an invitation to vengeance. It was an offer to stand in public with me, so the narrative wouldn't be mine alone. He nodded, a small, brave movement. "I don't want to be with someone who lied," he said. "I want to know I'm not crazy." Being believed matters more than most people realize. It validates woundings and transforms them from a private shame to a public wrong that can be addressed. I had expected to feel triumphant when the truth arrived. Instead, I felt relieved in a way that pained me because relief came with the cost of exposure. December approached like a drum roll. I slept poorly, and then without sleep at all. I caught myself smiling at ridiculous things, an advertisement for a paint color called Bravery, howling with laughter that tasted like a small rebellion. I signed a contract that would secure our house in the divorce settlement. It was a pragmatic move that felt strangely intimate, as though I were reclaiming the base of who I was. Vivian walked me through the paperwork with professional tenderness. "This is practical love," she said once, placing a legal pad under my pen. The dinner guest list for December 24 was uncomplicated. Marcus and me, Victoria and Alex, Lauren and James, Sam and one of his associates who would not be seated at the table, but would be nearby if things required a gentle nudge. Lauren put a sprig of rosemary on each plate because it smelled like my mother's kitchen. I chose navy napkins because they made my hands look steady. The lamb would be the centerpiece, roasted until the outside was a caramelized confession, the inside a soft, yielding thing. I wanted the meal to be beautiful, because beauty is its own kind of declaration. You are worthy of care, even if the world is not. The week before Christmas, I double-checked everything. Sam delivered a sealed envelope with a final addendum to his report and left it on my kitchen counter like a quiet threat. Vivian told me she would have the divorce papers ready to serve that night if I wanted. Alex said he would come early and wait in his car if that made me less anxious.
Marcus hummed in the hallway as he wrapped a gift he claimed was for me. His hands shook when he thought I wasn't looking. On December 24, the house smelled like cinnamon and roast meat. I had set the table 2 hours earlier, then walked through the kitchen 3 times, checking the oven, checking the wine, checking the napkin folds, until my fingers memorized the exact crease of the linen. The tree cast its patient light across the room. We put a playlist on with low, unfamiliar carols, music that suggested tradition without nostalgia. When Marcus told me, "My ex is coming for Christmas," I could have snatched the tablecloth and revealed everything. I could have thrown the wine in his face. Instead, I set my jaw, smiled in that same small way, and let the sentence sit like an uninvited guest at the table. People ask if it felt cruel to be calm. Cruelty presupposes joy. My calm wasn't joy. It was the cold geometry of someone who had decided the shape their life would take next. If you are still with me and you want to hear how it all unspooled, the ugly laundry, the papers, the ethics complaint, the way a practice unravels under scrutiny, hit subscribe. I promise not to give you a cheap thrill. I promise to tell you the truth, which is messier than you want, but also more useful than the fantasy of instantaneous justice. The meal begins the way any holiday meal does, gradually, with small talk. Marcus tells a mildly amusing story about a coworker. Lauren laughs in the perfect places. I listen and fold myself into the surface-level warmth, the way you hide your hands under a blanket. Alex arrives later than expected and stands on the porch, hat in hand, a nervous man in a navy coat who looks like he might forget the words to the carols. The door opens and the air changes. It's not just bodies moving through a frame. The arrival of another life into this space is a collision. People smile. They find each other's eyes. Small gestures are traded like old currencies. I pour wine because rituals have a way of settling people into roles. Marcus reaches for my hand the way men do who assume their presence is a leash. I let him touch me for a beat and then slide my fingers away. The lamb steams, and I think of all the meals I ate with him that were small lessons in acquiescence. We sit and we eat. Conversation circles like polite gulls around shallow topics. Work, weather, the neighbor's new puppy. There is a rhythm to the normal that feels vulnerable. It is easier to injure someone if you are not surprised by the position they occupy. And then the bell at the hall rings, one single chime that disperses the air between us like a thrown stone. The sound is both ordinary and monumental. It is Christmas Eve. The action I have planned for months will either land here or unravel. My hands are steady as I stand. The envelope at my side weighs like a heartbeat. I move toward the door, and in that half second before I open it, I think of the choices that made this night possible. The nights I spent alone mapping invoices, but tears I swallowed to keep my voice intact. The legal pads and quiet meetings. The way Lauren pressed her hand to my back and said, in the simplest language, "You don't have to do it alone." I reach for the doorknob. Outside, tires crunch on the drive, and the sound of a voice, Alex, I think, faints through the door. The house holds its breath. My fingers close around cold metal, and I lift the latch. I lift the latch, and the world tilts in a new way, like a painting someone has nudged in the night. Alex stands on the porch, hat in his hands, cheeks pink from the cold. He looks like every man who has shown up at the wrong time in someone else's story, awful and human and ridiculously vulnerable. Behind him, Victoria is small in her coat, hair pinned with an attempt at neatness. She smiles as if she believes smiles still buy her pauses and consequence. They step inside, and the air rearranges itself. Marcus stands to greet them the way a man greets an arrival he expects to applaud his hosting. He offers a hand to Victoria that is quick, practiced, the handshake of people who have rehearsed civility. I watch everything with the odd sense of distance you get behind glass, as if someone placed me inside a warm, breakable bubble and handed me a script.
Only the script isn't mine. Introductions flicker. Alex's eyes find mine, and for a second he looks relieved to arrive in a world where the person who wronged him is also visible. His breath is uneven. Victoria's smile slides over her face like a practiced patina, professional warmth that never went cold because it was never real heat to begin with. We sit. The first course arrives. Small, bright things. Endive with a shallow spoon of citrus and something bitter that tastes like the truth. Conversation skates over small talk. Marcus tells the story about the coworker whose dog chewed through a taxidermy foot. Everyone laughs in the places that are safe. I laugh in the places I've rehearsed. My hands are steady. My fingers know the crease of the napkin by memory. I take a sip of wine and let the tannins do their work, which is to steady the edges of me. Sam texts a single emoji across the table, the kind that means ready. He is seated in the living room, not at the table, an island of competence in a sea of porcelain. On the coffee table, near a bowl of polished walnuts, is the envelope he left 2 hours ago. It gleams the way a secret looks when it has been polished and wrapped. Vivian Porter, has positioned herself in the doorway in a kind of civilian armor, winter coat, practical heels, a face that reads like a ledger. Lauren sits by me, her jaw clenched but her fingers tapping little Morse code prayers on the outline of her wineglass. When the roasted lamb is brought to the table, steam curls up like a question mark.
The house smells like rosemary, and this is the only time the lamb will be a metaphor for surrender. Later, the lamb will be the memory of a meal where a body was exposed in public for private sins. For now, the lamb just smells like a good dinner. I let a beat pass and then rise. I think we should move to the living room for dessert, I say. It sounds like a small, conciliatory idea. Marcus grants it, as if I'm the mayor of some small domestic territory. He is almost proud to do so. We move, the party shuffling like deck chairs toward a different script. Standing there, with the piano's lid barely open and a Carol's playlist humbly playing in the background, I open the envelope. It is heavier than it ought to be. Inside are clean copies, the PI report, Sam's photographs, bank statements, the printed screenshots of messages that once crawled across a phone screen like flies. I do not feel triumphant. I feel like someone who has taken off an ill-fitting glove and discovered the skin beneath is not the same. Before I say anything, I begin, and my voice is the only one in the room that feels like mine. I want everyone to understand this is not theater. This is the record of choices made over months and the consequences that followed. I lay the documents on the piano as if setting a table again, but these are not plates. Sam steps forward and flips open his report, the margin notes like surgical labels. He reads the dates aloud, not in accusation, but in ledgered fact. June 16th, hotel room, room service charge. July 2nd, overnight stay. October 13th, public sighting at a cafe at 8:14 p.m. He hands a photograph across to Alex, Victoria stepping from a cab with a small bag, and Alex's face forgets to be polite. That photograph is from the night of June 16th? Alex asks, voice thready. Yes, Sam says. CCTV timestamp is attached. Transaction codes confirm the charges. A woman across the room, one of the friends who had observed from the gym, nods. I saw her there that week, she says. Her voice is small but steady. At the spa. I didn't think I had anything to do with it, but on June 15th, I say, and when I say the date, the room tilts again. I miscarried. The way I say the sentence is not loud. It doesn't need to be loud. It carries into the room like an object thrown across a table. Marcus's face changes. First confusion, then immediate recollection, a flash like a film burn of June's hospital lights. Victoria looks away, and for the first time her smile slips. I was in the hospital, I continue. I was alone for most of it. During that time, there were communications between Marcus and VH, Victoria Hawthorne, detailing plans. These are the messages, these photographs, these charges. I trace the line of evidence like a seamstress showing the stitch that held the fabric together. These are not accusations born of anger. These are records. Marcus's mouth forms around denials like a person trying to mime a word above water.
There are explanations. He reaches, reflexive, for his phone. Give me my phone. I have everything, I say. You have your explanations. There's no need to panic. The legal voice in me, the part Vivian has made me keep and practice, keeps the edges smooth. Vivian, please. Vivian stands and hands a copy of the divorce petition to Sam, who nods. He moves to the coffee table and sets another envelope down, a nominally ceremonial act that is actually a civil one. We filed this on December 25, he says. The date lodges like a pebble in a shoe. Service can be done now. Marcus's face doesn't understand the gravity at first. You filed? You, on Christmas? Yes, I say. I filed. The petition lists joint assets, proposed custody if necessary. It lists the timeline. I watch the blood drain from his face, which is not satisfying in itself. It is simply a sign that a man who has relied on plausibility is realizing that paper does not speak in charm. Victoria's hand goes to her throat. "What are you doing?" she murmurs, a phrase that used to be part of her practice, and inquiry in therapy now used as a demand. "You can't, this is private." "You, private?" I repeat. "You're a licensed therapist. You advertise trust. Where trust is exchanged for manipulation, that is not just personal, it's professional." There is a beat, and Alex stands. He is smaller than the photographs made him, and yet there is a truth in him now that he did not carry in the pictures. He faces Victoria, and the deflation that comes off him is like a small wind. "You told me you loved me," he says, not in accusation, but in betrayal translated. "You told me we were building a life." Victoria's eyes fray with the kind of panic that cannot be charm. It's complicated," she says, but the word collapses under its own weight. I let Sam hand the PI photos around. Marcus's denial becomes strangulation of words. He tries to frame the evidence as misinterpretation, old photos taken out of context, a professional necessity for therapists who meet people in hotels while on the road, a spin as practiced as any of his public apologies would be. I have heard all these tones before. I have learned to hear them and keep a ledger. When Vivian speaks, it is as though the room has been given a legal son. "There is an ethics complaint in this envelope," she says. "It will be filed with the board tomorrow. The complaint includes dates, witness testimony, the PI report, and public posts that document a pattern. She does not promise outcomes. It is not her job. But the presence of the complaint means actions will follow, and action is a kind of consequence." At that point, Marcus reaches toward me, voice pleading, something about a misunderstanding, about love, which is what guilty people mistake for absolution. He tries to blame me in the way men with privilege sometimes do, make the woman the hysteric, the unstable variable. "You don't have to do this," he says, eyes devouring me for a crack.
"Actually," I say, and the words are small and exact, "I do. I have to be intact for myself. The alternatives are either silence or structure. I've chosen structure." There is no theatrical scream. There is a sharp, practical exchange. Papers are placed. Vivian confirms service. Sam records witness statements. Marcus gropes for salvage, for a clean version of his life that might still exist after the scandal. But salvage requires consent from other parties. Alex does not consent to being part of whatever fantasy Marcus is pitching. The key moment is not a shout. It is the slow, unglamorous collapse of plausible deniability. The photographs cannot be smoothed. The transactions cannot be unbilled. The internet posts remain like a public ledger. Victoria's practice, when she calls her answering service now, hears not the usual questions about intake, but voicemails begging for explanations. By the end of the night, she is fielding messages from clients she cannot yet face. "I need to put a note on my profile," she tells a colleague through the phone, voice thin and trembling. "I am stepping back pending investigation." It is a phrase that, in this case, matters, because people who pay for trust expect someone who models safety. When the model fractures, clients flee. The immediate fallout is private and wide, whispers that travel, the slow dispersion of social ties, the polite but cutting text from people who choose sides as if loyalty were a consumable. Marcus lashes out in the days after, emails to former colleagues attempting to explain, a terse message to my sister that contains both a plea and a threat, a public post framed as a mea culpa that reads like damage control copy. I have learned to catalog expressions of remorse and to recognize when someone is simply shoplifting dignity. The board did, in this case, place an interim administrative hold on Victoria's practice pending investigation. I say in this case because I know the danger of generalizing legal consequences. Boards are inconsistent and human institutions are imperfect. But the action itself, this administrative hearing, happened, initiated because clients were contacting the practice, because the complaint included meticulous documentation, and because a therapist's ethics board is at its core allergic to conflict of interest. Marcus's firm put him on leave pending their own internal investigation. Again, outcomes differ in other stories, but here his boss called HR and did what bosses must sometimes do to preserve the company's public image. She put him on leave until things calmed. For him, the leave meant more than missing work. It meant a slow erosion of status that acts like an invasive mold. You notice it in small things, the lack of emails, the silence of former allies, the way invitations stop arriving. Weeks after the dinner, there were hearings, one administrative, one with the therapy board.
The language of the hearings was sober and procedural, the sort of thing that has the effect of turning human betrayal into a list of constraints and citations. In a hearing room 3 months later, the board's decision recommended a temporary suspension pending a full review. It's not the sort of cinematic fall that leaves people gasping. It is bureaucratic, the way life often is when it turns necessary and dull, the opposite of dramatic, and therefore more effective. There were also legal negotiations. Vivian negotiated quietly, with a steady hand, the terms that would allow me to keep the house, an action that mattered more than I could explain to people who hadn't done the arithmetic of grief. Money is not a substitute for love, but it is a salve for practicality, the ability to stay in the home where our children, if we'd had them, would have grown, the ability to keep the things that mattered for memory. The settlement, which closed in late March, granted me the house and a division of assets that, in this case, left me able to breathe. I do not tell the numbers because that invites comparison and gossip. Numbers are private scaffolding. The point is that I was able to reconstruct a base. But even with legal wins, there is a distinct body place where the hurt lives. The night after everything unfolded, I sat on the living room floor with pieces of the PI report and drank whiskey that tasted like regret. I kept thinking of June 15th and how the hospital lights had dictated a different script for me, thinking of how in all my life I had imagined my husband as the keeper of pain, and he had been keep of another person's confidences. There was no public applause for vindication. There was only a private collapse that required hospital-grade tenderness. Lauren was there. She sat on the floor with me, legs crossed, a casserole dish cooling on the counter. She had stayed at the house to make sure I didn't step into any harm. She took my hand and we made a ritual of silence, the kind of silence two people can hold when words are both useless and necessary. There was a form of intimacy in that stillness that I had not anticipated. It is not glamorous, but it is saving. Therapy mattered more than I can say. I began seeing a therapist in January, someone who did not counsel me toward revenge, but toward a framework in which I could locate my sense of self again. We talked about grief and the ways betrayal occupies space inside you like a new furniture arrangement that you did not choose, but must now live with. I learned to name emotions without letting them run my life. Shame, righteous anger, the deep and peculiar isolation of having your private life made public. There were nights when I felt diminished. There were mornings when I felt cleanly hungry for life. One of the most unexpected parts of the months that followed was how many women reached out.
At first, it was close friends, then friends of friends, then strangers in comments and messages who told variations of the same story. A partner who lied, a betrayal that took place in the scaffolding of everyday life. They wrote to say my story made them feel less insane and more accountable to themselves and to what passed for decorum in their homes. I listened to them, and I told them the truth that had sustained me. Not that they should seek revenge, but that they deserved the autonomy to choose their path, and that evidence and practical planning can be tools for safety. In March, there were hearings and negotiations. Ultimately, in this case, Marcus and I reached a settlement that allowed me to keep the home and secured financial stability for the immediate future. He agreed to the division of assets and to limited contact arrangements. I do not present that as a universal remedy. I present it as what happened. It felt like survival, not triumph. Victoria's professional life did not fully recover. The investigation found enough of a pattern to recommend sanctions. She was required to undergo a period of supervised practice and was temporarily prohibited from seeing clients while the board reviewed her actions. She issued a public statement that read like many such press releases: regret and acknowledgement of mistakes, a promise to seek remediation. Part of me felt hollow when I read it. Part of me felt something else, an odd sense of justice that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with truth being seen. Alex and I did not become lovers in the melodramatic way some revenge tales suggest. That was not my design nor his desire. He became, quietly and painfully, an ally. We met twice more after that night. Each time the conversations were about settling his own life and deciding whether he wanted to rebuild himself outside of that relationship. He chose not to stay tied to that wound. He thanked me once for telling him the truth in a manner that spared him the humiliation of being the last to find out. We parted with a hand on the back and a shared sense of salvage. The cost of truth is not only legal, it is the slow corrosion of naive certainties and the hard growth that follows. There were friends we lost, people who took sides or who could not handle the public messiness of it all. There were people we gained, the ones who showed up at odd hours with casseroles and legal referrals and the ferocious tenderness of sisters who would not let us fall. There is an arithmetic of loss that accounts for these transactions. The ledger is full, and it is not all bad. In the months that followed, I rebuilt the architecture of my days. I returned to work with a fierceness I hadn't known I possessed. The small design projects I'd taken on in stolen hours became a studio. I had always painted in the margins of my life. Now I painted in the middle.
I started a small design agency that focused on intimate spaces, homes, small businesses, places where people put their lives back together in the way they arrange furniture and color their walls. It was not a work of escapism. It became method. Writing happened because I needed to speak in longer form. Letters to myself became essays that became chapters. I wanted to give the story a name that wasn't vengeful in the cartoon sense. My beautiful vengeance felt right. Beautiful because the life reclaimed was beautiful. Vengeance because the truth had force and had to be allowed to remedy what had been taken. The book took 2 years. It was not an overnight success. It was honest, which sometimes matters more. When the book came out, it sparked not only curiosity, but community. Women sent me photographs of their own living rooms and told me how they had booked therapy after reading a chapter, how they had met with an attorney, and most importantly, how they had learned to name patterns that had haunted their relationships. Some wrote to say they'd stood up at their workplaces and said no to being gaslit. A few wrote to say the book had given them the vocabulary to demand change. The platform that emerged felt like a new kind of ministry, less about conversion and more about clarity. I am clear-eyed about what I did and what it cost. There were nights I replayed events and wondered whether I had been cruel in the same measure I had been hurt. There is no pure moral geometry here. There are only uneven angles. I asked myself whether exposing another human being to public scrutiny could be justified. I told myself the truth. When someone in a position of trust uses that position to exploit, visibility can be an instrument of protection for potential future harms. That is not an argument for humiliation. It is an argument for accountability. My choice was to make contact with truth visible in the places where it mattered. The community response surprised me. People invited me to speak at small gatherings, then larger ones. They asked about the intersection of betrayal and professionalism, about how cower shapes the stories people tell themselves about what is permissible. I found myself in conversations I never would have imagined, talking about boundaries, evidence, and the slow business of rebuilding trust inside a community. I remember one event where a woman came up to me afterwards and said, "I almost left, but I didn't have the language." She pressed my hand and said, "Now I do." That kind of thing is not vindication in the petty sense. It's consequence in the restorative sense. There are quieter things that matter more than public outcomes. The way a morning walk felt after months of ached sleep. The small rituals I built with Lauren. On Thursdays, we go to our favorite cafe and do what our mother used to call chores of the heart. We talk about nothing and everything and then split a slice of lemon cake. We learn to practice joy as an act of reclamation, which is not to say joy is a cure. Joy is a small daily resistance. I also learned to forgive in a way I had never expected. I do not forgive because the harm was minor. I forgive because hanging on to the rage at every single minute would have kept my life suspended in a dark room. Forgiveness for me became a strategic lowering of the temperature, not an erasure. It did not mean I excused what happened. It meant I would not be defined solely by what was done to me. There were nights, months later, when I would stand in the kitchen and the silverware would catch the light, and I would think of that precise crease in the napkin and let out a breathless laugh at the absurdity of how meticulously I had planned. Planning was a tool. It did not fill the hollow places, but it allowed me to direct the path of my life rather than let someone else keep doing so. In the present, a few years on, my life is not tidy. The scars are not vanity projects. They are marks like the seams of a well-made garment. I have new work I love. My studio is small and bright, plastered with swatches and mood boards, and I travel to speak sometimes about reassembling life after betrayal. The book became a modest bestseller, which meant more readers and more letters and some interviews that felt oddly exposing and oddly useful. I keep the house. I keep the friendships that mattered. I keep my quiet rituals. Men and women still court me with the same old scripts of apologies and grand declarations. I meet them with the same small smile I have practiced, the smile that is not meant to comfort but to measure. I am wary of charm that does not come with consistency.
I have learned to ask not for grand gestures, but for reliability in small things. Sometimes people in the comments ask me if I regret the way I exposed everything. Was it worth it, they ask. My answer is never simple. Part of me mourns the loss of an imagined life that had children and older years with white paint and picnics, and a husband who would someday sit on the porch and tell the story of how he once was thoughtless and then redeemed. That life was not mine. Another part of me is glad that the truth was not smoothed over, because smoothing over often means future harm continues. If I had to name what I learned, it would be this. Agency is not a dramatic action executed in a single night. It is a series of small, hard choices that accrue to make a life you can live in. I chose measured truth. I chose to collect evidence not because I wanted to hurt, but because I needed a record to hold in my two hands when grief came. I chose legal structure because grief is messy, and structure gives it direction. None of those choices were without cost. Sometimes late at night, I still rehearse the way the chandelier caught the light during that meal. It was a beautiful room for terrible news, and that is part of the irony of the entire thing.
There is a kind of poetry in setting a table for truth. It is not triumphant or petty, it is just necessary. I am the woman who smiled when he said, "My ex is coming for Christmas," and then did what I had to do next. I gathered my evidence, I surrounded myself with honest people, I employed a lawyer who read statutes like scripture, and I demanded accountability. That story is not only about exposing betrayal, it is about the slow, unglamorous reassembly of a life. It is about sisterhood and the small culinary rituals that remind you you are worthy of care. It is about choosing a career that allowed me to build beauty out of brokenness, and about putting down a pen to write the story so others might read it and not feel as alone. If you have been betrayed, I will not tell you exactly what to do. There is no universal manual. But I will tell you this. Gather your facts, seek counsel, and build a small, patient network of people who will hold you up when the world tilts. You will be tempted to act in fervor. You will be tempted to fetishize revenge as a single cathartic moment. Most of us, in truth, rebuild with quieter tools. Documents, friends, therapy, the slow recalibration of our days. I close with gratitude for the people who held me, the friends who wrote careful notes, the strangers who sent messages saying they had found the courage to leave, the sister who never let me stand alone. If this story lands in your life because you yourself are balancing the weight of betrayal, know this. You are allowed to take time to collect your proof and your wits. You are allowed to prioritize safety. You are allowed to choose dignity over spectacle. If you've been through something similar and want to share or ask questions, leave a comment. If this helped you feel less alone, consider supporting the channel or sharing the story with someone who might need to know they're not the only one. I read what you write. Sometimes I respond. Mostly I sit with the company of those who have chosen to reclaim themselves, slowly and without apologies.